Hi, everybody. My name is Miss Amber, and I'm here with your English 11A live lessons for today. So today's lesson is on unreliable narrators in realism. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen to get started. Alrighty, so we're going to start this off on slide number 5, like usual. So slide number 5 basically talks about relying on a narrator, and basically just goes into what that is and why we do it. So pretty much when you're reading a story, you expect the story to basically be telling you the truth about what's happening. You're reading, you're seeing what's happening, the story is describing, or the narrator in the story is describing what is happening, what the characters are thinking, the decisions that are being made. Especially in first person point of view. Just as a reminder, first person point of view are stories that use I, me, and my. So whenever you go to tell your friend a story about something that happened to you, and you say, well, when I went to the store today, I ran into, like insert person here, and she gave me the side eye, or, I ran into one of my best friends and we decided to hang out together, right? So when you're saying that, you're saying it happened to you personally. I did this. It happened to me. So that's first person. I, me, and my. Those 3 words. When you have a story that's like that, pretty much you only get one perspective in the story. So there's only one person telling the story. You only get to know about the story from the perspective of that one person. So you only have that one point of view to tell you about what's going on in the actual story. So you kind of have no choice but to trust what's being said. But there are some stories where the narrator or the person telling the story isn't reliable for some reason. So either they're lying to you about some of the things that happen in the story, or during the story, you realize that either they're very biased about something, or that they just can't read the minds of everyone who is in the story. In some cases, you'll even find out that the character is either imagining things or doesn't actually have the information that they're guessing about. And this happens sometimes when you're dealing with like dream sequences in TV shows or movies. You'll go through a whole bunch of story. Some details will seem not quite right, but possible. So you believe them. And then in the end, you find out, oh, well, this was all a dream of this one person. So the story isn't actually real. And if this did happen, it might not happen this exact way. So that's an example of an unreliable narrator. So when you come across a story like that, you have to decide which parts of the story are likely true and which ones likely aren't. With a TV show or a movie, it's a little easier to guess. You can pretty much say like, oh, well, I noticed this one detail was off, or this one character said this one thing and it didn't quite make sense based on what we know about this character. So you pretty much just have to look for clues. In a book, it's not any different. The clues are just a little harder to look for because you actually have to read and understand the story and what it's telling you to pick out the details that don't seem quite right. So on this slide, they give you 2 main reasons why readers might doubt a narrator's credibility. So those 2 reasons, and these are just the big reasons, there are other ones. A lack of sophistication. So normally in a story where something seems sloppy or not done quite right, that's usually a hint that someone is unreliable. If they don't know how to articulate something, if they're mixing up details of a story, like they don't have it all together. And usually that's a sign that they might be either lying or that they don't actually know what's going on in the story that they're telling. The second reason is a lack of sanity. So the character who's telling the story may actually just be crazy or have a loss of memory or amnesia or some other mental issues. So this lesson focuses on Unreliable narrators in the realism period. So it's important to note that the realist period is not where unreliable narrators first came up. It's not where they were first invented. But unreliable narrators played a big part in realism stories and did a good job at pointing out societal flaws. Because when you're writing people realistically the way they are, you have to also write about their flaws too. And normal everyday people sometimes don't know what they're talking about. Sometimes they don't know the full story or the full details about something. They're biased because of their upbringing or whoever is coaching them or telling them things. So it's easy to fit unreliable narrators in realist stories because realistically, human beings do not have all the answers to things. So looking at realist period stories is a good way to get an idea of what an unreliable narrator is. Okay, so on slide 6, we get started with a list of types of unreliable narrators. So they give you an example on this slide of the unsophisticated narrator. Now, there are different types of unsophistication. Some of it is just a person not really knowing the full story. Some of it is a person just sort of being biased in some way. But the example that they give you is something that you don't see very often these days, which is a child's point of view. Children don't understand how complex and layered some things can be. So they describe everything in like a simple way with words that they just happen to know at the time that they're telling you the story. And because that is what they're doing, it's very easy to point out that there's something missing from the story and the narrative. So the example that they give you in this story, or I'm sorry, in this lesson, is To Kill a Mockingbird. To Kill a Mockingbird is a story by Harper Lee, and the narrator of the story is a young girl from a small town in the 1930s. And this book deals with a lot of racism. This was the book that's very famously known for a Black man being on trial for a crime that he didn't commit. And basically the people in this small town realizing that things were very biased and having to fight against systemic racism to try to win the case for this person. But the story is told from the point of view of a young girl whose name is Scout. And because she's so young, she doesn't understand why race is an issue. And she doesn't understand why people are attempting to lynch people and willing to fight and come to blows over the issue of race and how people should be treated. Because she doesn't understand all of that, they're described in a way that shows that she's ignorant or doesn't know and understand these things. So you can tell by the way that in this story, those things are described, that the narrator's not reliable. Because if a child is telling the story, then obviously they don't have all of the knowledge they need to tell the story correctly and give you all the details that you actually need to understand what's happening in her town. So that's a good example of an unreliable narrator. She's not unreliable because she's lying to you. She's unreliable because she herself doesn't understand everything that is happening. So she can't explain to you, the reader, what's happening. You kind of have to piece together some stuff between the lines from what she tells you based on what you know about how people are in the story. On slide 7, we move into narrators that have a lack of sanity. So the reason why these are considered unreliable is because when you have mental and emotional issues like that, you can't really tell which events actually take place in the story and which ones are imagined. It's really hard to tell when someone is possibly having hallucinations, or if they're, like daydreaming and imagining things and they think they're real. It's hard to tell which parts actually happened and which parts are like just made up. So they give you an example from The Black Cat, which is an excerpt from a previous lesson. Um, this is an Edgar Allan Poe work. So it's kind of dark and mysterious. And you can't really tell in this story if there's a mark on the cat's chest in this story, and you can't actually tell if the mark is growing throughout the story or not, or if the change is only happening in the narrator's head because they have mental issues. So the story tells you this is what's happening, but because you know that the narrator has mental issues and might be too anxious and panicky to actually know what's going on, he's got some signs of insanity in the story. You have to actually ask yourself as the reader, like, so did this actually happen? Or was he just imagining this? Now, you might wonder why someone would use an unreliable narrator to tell a story. Sometimes it's to point out how ridiculous something is. So, for example, the young girl in To Kill a Mockingbird who's telling the story. The point of telling the story from that point of view is to sort of add a little bit to the idea that racism doesn't make sense. It's not something that's naturally occurring. Children don't understand it. It's something that has to be taught to people in terms of how you view and treat other human beings. And by using a young white girl's point of view, you get the sense of the commentary that the author's making, which is that if children are not like born feeling that way naturally, then this is something we're teaching them, and that means that it's wrong. It also, even though her testimony is like kind of unreliable, it gives you sort of a lens that's kind of unbiased because she's not on either side and she's just trying to figure out what is happening in her town and why things are a big deal. And there are other reasons to use unreliable narrators as well. You can use dramatic irony. Dramatic irony, just as a refresher, is when you're reading a story, watching a movie or a play, and the reader or the audience is given information that the characters don't have. So maybe the unreliable narrator notices something and you, the reader, know that it's important, but they write it off because they're crazy or they're ignorant and they don't know how important it is. So you, as a reader, will basically see the gap between what the characters know and what you know. And you know either that the events are not actually happening the way that the narrator is describing, or that there's something coming up that's going to deeply affect how the narrator views things. And that's just useful because it's engaging. You know, that sort of cliche of someone yelling at the screen because there's, you know, like a killer in the background, and the main character doesn't see them creeping up on them. It creates that sort of effect. If you realize that the narrator is crazy and you can't trust what it is that they're saying, you start looking for clues for what is actually happening in the movie and also in books. A good example of this is in M. Night Shyamalan's Split. There are some other horror movies about either split personality disorder or other types of like mental issues, memory relapses and stuff like that, where you can't trust what the narrator is telling you or showing you because they don't remember there's some other mental blockage or something like that. It's something that actually comes up really often in stories because it keeps the audience engaged. You want to know what's actually happening, not just what the character is seeing. It makes you want to put together the whole story before the character does. So it keeps you paying attention. Alrighty. So this slide, number 8, is the effects of an unreliable narrator. So they talk about the clues that authors leave, and they give you actually an example here. The point of leaving clues is to give you a hint that maybe the character that's talking or telling the story shouldn't be trusted. And they give you an example of one of these clues, which is a narrator mentioning how other people view them. So the example they give you here is Priscilla has told me that I need to forget about the child I saw in the woods, but I know he's still there. So the reason why the author might mention Priscilla's opinion of like the narrator's, like interest in the child in the woods, it basically tells you that she's seeing things, right? And that other people think that she's seeing things. So that's a hint that maybe this person isn't as trustworthy as they should be. If someone on the outside is just kind of like, yeah, this is a little much, you're kind of obsessed, you should just, chill out on that. Maybe you need a break. It creates doubt in the reader or the watcher's mind. You're like, oh, well, maybe they're haunted, but maybe they're crazy. We'll have to watch and actually see and find out. And then there's reference to what I mentioned earlier, like to kill a mockingbird. Scout shows Scout, the little girl that tells the story, points out that racism is wrong, and also she's able to see that it's everywhere, because when she sees it, it doesn't seem right to her, and she's able to point it out, at least in the story. Okay, so the reading selection for this lesson is the yellow wallpaper. Some of you who have taken English classes at brick and mortar schools may have already read this story. This is definitely a story that has an unreliable narrator. It's a very famous story for showing off that fact. So we get a little information about the author before we go into the reading. So the author's name is Charlotte Perkins Gilman. And she used her writing to contribute to social reform in the early 1990s. So basically supporting civil rights, especially rights for women, for equal rights. And she's actually the great niece of the abolitionist who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. Her name was Harriet Beecher Stowe. And so she's just pretty well known in terms of being descended from like a writer's family sort of thing. And she wrote about mental and emotional issues from a personal standpoint. They didn't have a word for really what she had then, but she pretty much had postpartum depression in a way that extended throughout her life. At the time, the name that they had for it wasn't really accurate. They called it neurasthenia. So that it was just a name for the symptoms that she had. So being tired and not having a good mood, basically depression. And she was treated with something called rest cure. So rest cure is a specific type of treatment where they basically made you stay inside all the time. You couldn't do anything for yourself. You weren't allowed to go anywhere or do anything, move around or anything. And it's been proven today that those sort of things actually make mental health worse. And at the time that she was alive, she has said that it nearly drove her insane. And she's able to write about and express that experience in The Yellow Wallpaper. So The Yellow Wallpaper reflects her experience. It's a story about a woman who's actually driven insane by having to rest in a similar way that she had to. At the bottom of this slide, they give you a little more information about her. There's a small essay called Why I Wrote the Yellow Wallpaper, which explains the connection between the story, her life, and her expression of what she lived through. So take a moment to click on that and read through it. And then we'll meet you over at slide 11. Okay, slide 11 gives you a strategy for reading. It's called OPINES, and that's just an acronym, OPINES. So it's supposed to give you steps for analyzing and trying to study a text so that you can take notes that will actually help you. The point of the OPINES chart or list is to help you fill in the answer to the questions that you're asked through the reading. So each of the letters in opines stands for a question. And the idea is as you read, you would fill in the answer to these questions. So we're going to go through each of these just so that you know what the questions are. And this isn't something that's just good for this one story. The important thing about opines is that if you create a chart like this for every story, you'll have the important answers that you actually need for breaking down the text and understanding it. So this doesn't just work for this one lesson. You can actually keep this acronym and create a chart like this for every story you read, and it will definitely help you get more information and understanding about the story. So we're going to just go through all the letters. O is for organization. So how is the text organized? If you've gone through English 9 and 10 with us, you know that there are different ways to organize your text. In case you haven't, some of the examples for how to organize a text is chronological order. That's when you write about things from start to finish. You start at the beginning and you go to the end. Spatial organization is the second one. If you are writing about how things look and how they're positioned, that's spatial. So for example, if you're writing a small paper explaining the parts on a bike, you might actually organize it to start from like a picture of a bike, the parts from left to right, starting with like the front wheel and then moving through all the parts. That's spatial because you're describing the positions of things. Spatial as in space, the space between things. Another way of organizing a text is to do it by order of importance. So if you have a topic, you want to address the most important thing about that topic first, and then the things that are less important in order as you go down. So for example, if you are writing about steps to take to escape from like a fire emergency, you're going to write it in order of importance. What are the things that you actually have to do first? And then you'll move down the chart for things depending on what priority they take. The stuff at the end will probably be, well, if you can get around to this, then yes, do this. But if you can't get around to this, then it's okay. It's more important for you to know about the stuff at the top first. So those are some examples of how text is organized. So you want to look at a story. Usually stories are chronological. They have a beginning and then they go in order until the end. But some stories are broken up in odd ways. So it's important to just keep in mind and note which way it is. Some stories start in the middle and then move forward. Some stories are like they jump around from different people's perspectives, and they're not entirely in time order. Some stories deliberately are not told in chronological order to make a point. And I won't give you go into too much detail about that, but it's just important to note which way a text is organized. The second letter is P for purpose. The purpose is, why do you think the author wrote the text? That's definitely a question that is easier to answer the further you are in the book. Sometimes it's just as simple as the author just wanting people to know information about how something can happen to people. Sometimes a story is just to entertain people, especially if it's funny or if there's like a lot of adventuring happening, a lot of triumphs, a lot of treasure, that kind of stuff. Sometimes people write to convince you of something. So if the story is about like a compelling topic that people argue over, then you would make a note that maybe the text and story is trying to convince you of a point of view. The third letter is I. The I is impression. What is your first impression of the text? And then they give you examples of what first impression means. So what genre is it? So like, for example, if you're reading a book and it starts off with telling you that there are witches and wizards and magic, that tells you that this is a fantasy genre. If it starts off with like high technology, maybe people being able to like put their consciousness in a different body, maybe there's a lot of like advanced flying cars and stuff like that, that would tell you it's sci-fi. Maybe it's a Civil War era story, and you're just not sure until you actually get a couple pages in. But that's part of the first impression. So what genre, what category of story does it belong to? The second question they ask here, or they give you as an example here, is what is the point of view? Remember that there are three different types of points of view, three different main types. There's first person, which is I, me, and my, someone's talking about themselves. Second person is you. The person telling the story is telling you, the reader, what's happening to you, especially if it's like a choose your own adventure sort of deal. And the last one is third person, which is when you get he and she. So just as a recap, first person, I, me, and my. Second person, you, yours. Third person, he, she. And when you're looking at third person, there are two subtypes of third person. The two subtypes are limited, which is when you only know about one person in the story, and omniscient, which is when you know the thoughts and movements and feelings of everyone in a story. So it's important to know that because authors choose to do that on purpose. And if the story is just someone telling you a thing that happened to them, then you get different types of information that you would get from like third person he or she stories. The next question is where is the setting? So the setting is when and where the story takes place. And that's also important. It's related to the genre very often. Does this take place in modern times? Does it take place in the future? Does it take place in a made up land that doesn't exist, that's supposed to be kind of like our time? Does it take place like in a specific season? When in the year the story happens is sometimes important too. And then the last sample question they give you is what is the mood? And by mood, they mean what are you supposed to feel when you're reading the story? So for example, when we're talking about The Fall of the House of Usher, that's an Edgar Allan Poe story. It starts off in a dark and gloomy forest. The narrator is talking about how the lands are barren, how the sky is dark and it looks like it's dusk, even though it's not actually evening yet. They talk about how cold it is, how there isn't another person for miles. And he has to travel specifically to get to the House of Usher to talk to the head of the family. Because the woods are barren, everything is gray, everything is dark, dank, gloomy, scary, random, creepy noises in the forest. The mood is supposed to be eerie or unsettling, because if you were looking at that in real life or even in a movie, you would say like, that's very creepy. So that's the mood of the text. You have to pay attention to how things are described in the story to figure out what the mood is. If you're describing like a happy first day of school, you wouldn't use words like gloomy, dank, dark, dusk. You wouldn't say there's no one around and it's desolate. You wouldn't say that the place is deserted. Those words don't fit that kind of mood. So it's important to keep in mind how things are being described. The next one is N for new words. So just a reminder, if you come across a word you don't know while you're reading, take time to look it up. Staring at a vocabulary list is not going to help you remember anything. It's very important for you to take the time to look something up. If you've seen a word before and you don't remember what it means, still look it up, because doing that over and over will help you remember. Eventually, you'll get to the point where your brain's like, I've done this before. I remember doing this. Here's what this word means. And that's basically how we learn new vocabulary. The next letter is E. E is evaluate. When you answer that question, the purpose question earlier on, you have to ask yourself towards the end of the story, did the author do what it seemed like they were set out to do? If they were trying to convince you to feel a certain way about something, do you think they did? Yes or no? Why or why not? And what do you think about the text? So like if you read the story and you have thoughts about whether or not it made sense or didn't, or if it's dumb, or if there was a point to it, those thoughts are what you should put in the evaluate section. And lastly, but not least, synthesize. It says, how can you relate to what you've read what you've read to your own life. So you have to take elements from the story, even if it's just something like rejection that someone feels, or wanting to be great or take care of your family, things like that. You can break the story down into things that you relate to. Maybe, for example, what happens in the yellow wallpaper that we're going to read isn't something that has happened to you directly, but maybe there's specific feelings that are described in the story that you felt before. So even things as small as that can help you relate to your life. I will say, to do this last one, you do have to actually understand the general gist of the story that happened. So make sure that you're reading carefully and not just dragging your eyes over the page. The way that you understand stories enough to pass these mastery tests is to actually take time to read them. Alrighty. On slide 12, they give you an example of an Opines chart that has been partially filled out by a student. So they give you a couple questions about the text that you should consider while you're reading. And that combined with this chart should give you an idea of what to look for. It's partially filled in. You've got some stuff for every single column except for synthesize. Not all of the columns have both sections filled out, 1, 2, but there's a healthy dose of them that do, and the other 2 do have something in them. So these actually gives you information for the story that'll help prep you. So take a look at these, make a chart of your own. If you do make a chart of your own, don't just copy down what's in here. Actually add something that you think as you're reading the yellow wallpaper. The link is right here at the bottom of the slide. Take your time to open it up and read. Before you read, they gave you a couple questions. 1, how does Gilman show that the narrator is unreliable? Because remember, that's what this lesson is about. How do they show that you can't trust the narrator? And 2, the story is written in short stream of consciousness paragraphs. So the paragraphs are supposed to seem like a person's thoughts. So they ask you what might have been Gilman's purpose, that means the why, in writing this way. Why did she write the story like that? That's something you should think about while you're reading. Now, of course, as always, I'm not going to review the reading selections directly with you guys. We'll be working on having dedicated videos for that. But what I want to do is tell you that if you are confident that you can read through this without any issues, take a moment to pause, read it, and then meet me at slide 14 for the analysis. If you start reading and you think you're having issues with understanding the text, you can look at the analysis first, go through the rest of the video, and then go back and read. But it is important that you actually go through and read the story, especially because there will be questions on the mastery test that have quotes directly from the story. If you cannot figure out what is going on with the story at all, like literally you just don't understand it, I would encourage you to book a tutoring session. You can do that with either myself or with Kathy Vahovic. Alrighty. Pause if you need to, don't if you don't, and I'll meet you at slide 14 for the analysis. I encourage everyone to at least try to read through the story once and just do what you can. All right, we're at slide 14. We're here for the analysis, and the analysis basically tells us the summary of the story. The story explores the effects of rest cure on a woman who is stuck living predominantly in one bedroom in a remote mansion in the countryside. So this woman is stuck in one room constantly all the time. She's lucid. That means that she seems self-aware and managing and sensible in the beginning. She starts to fixate. That means becomes like bullet laser focused on repellent yellow wallpaper in the bedroom. So she's fixated on the wallpaper. She describes it as repellent, almost revolting. So she's like repulsed by it. She thinks it's terrible. And along with the lack of stimulation of any kind, so she's basically trapped in a room by herself, it slowly drives her insane. And the author demonstrates that she's unreliable over the course of the story, and it gets worse and worse. So she seems fine in the beginning, but as she keeps going on describing things, you start to notice there's some things that are off about her descriptions of things. So, for example, she starts talking about the wallpaper, and she ascribes it or describes it as having powers that it possibly can't have. So they give you a quote here. This paper looks to me as if it knew what a vicious influence it had. There's no way a wallpaper could know that. There's absolutely no way. At the beginning, maybe you would write this off as just like, oh, she's just being creative in how she expresses her hatred for the wallpaper. But as you go through the story, it just gets worse and worse. On slide 15, they describe some other characters in the story and how things get worse. So eventually, her imagination gets to the point where she starts to see figures in her room. And the figures that she sees are in the wallpaper. So she thinks that the wallpaper is actually alive and that there's someone in there. At the point of the story where you get to this, she's going crazy from being trapped in her room so much that she's excited to know that there's another person in the wallpaper. Now, as soon as you get to this point, you're just kind of like, yeah, she's nuts. It becomes very obvious very quickly after she starts examining the wallpaper very closely. The sad thing, and that creates dramatic irony in this story, which we talked about earlier, is that the other characters in the story, like John and the main character's sister, Jane, they think that her condition is improving. But because you get the story from the narrator, the woman's point of view, you know that she's actually just getting worse over time. So you have knowledge about what's actually happening that the other characters don't have. And that's what dramatic irony is. You know that she's getting worse. You know that she's crazy, but everyone around her thinks that she's getting better. So by the end of the story, the narrator basically confirms that she's crazy. So she assumes the identity of the woman in the wallpaper. So the story ends with one of these lines. I've got out at last, said I, in spite of you and Jane, and I've pulled off most of the wallpaper, so you can't put me back. So when she says that, she at this point thinks that she's the woman who was in the wallpaper and that she managed to break out of it. So that's the line that confirms for sure that she is actually crazy and that you can't count on anything that she said as being real. So on slide 16, we talk about how she wrote things. Gilman writes the story in the stream of consciousness sentences. And the reason why she does this is to give you a better sense of what's going on in this character's mind. You actually get to read things the way that she's thinking them or something close to it. So there are sentences and paragraphs of just a few words, and she's able to make this feel uncertain. So this author, by doing the stream of consciousness thing, is able to give you the sense of how the narrator feels and is thinking very quickly. And having sentences and paragraphs that just have a few words in them, like very simple sentences and things, you get the sense that she's a simple woman or immature in terms of how she phrases things. You feel like she needs John's care because she can barely like phrase things in a way that makes sense. Another thing that she does is uses the first person point of view. So since the narrator is talking about herself and her experiences in the story, you get like a very close personal look at what's going on in this story. You get to find things firsthand with the person who's narrating the story. So this also brings you in to understand the effects that rest cure is having on this woman because she's not allowed to go outside or do anything. And it kind of gives you a little peek into what it's like to go insane. You just think things are happening that are not actually happening. And because you're in her head, you get to hear the story as like, here's what I am doing. When I looked at the yellow wallpaper, it looked back at me, that kind of thing. You get the closest possible information to what she's experiencing. And lastly, what they cover here is just a reminder that realism and the realist period focused on how the human mind works. Instead of just writing about people reflecting, being deep and great, and those sort of things, they very specifically tried to write realistically about what people experience. So Gilman pretty much wrote the yellow wallpaper to show people why rest cure was dangerous and to reflect the information she had from her own experiences into this story. All righty. I think the rest of this, yes, the rest of this is actually just vocabulary. So this is a fairly short lesson. So the focus on language gives you a chart of vocabulary. Make sure that you actually write these down. Now, you don't have to write down the entire chart. I'm not here to tell you should write down the entire chart. But what you should absolutely do is write down the word and the part of speech and write down the definition. If you need the pronunciations, you can add those notes. If you need the other parts of speech, you can add those. But the two that you absolutely need is the word and part of speech and the definition. Now, the reason why it's important for you to write these down is because if they're giving you a vocabulary chart at the end of this lesson, what that tells me is that there absolutely is going to be questions on the mastery test regarding vocabulary. So just make sure that you write those down. Let's see. I think that this is actually it. Yep, it sure is. All right, I'll stop sharing. So this was a relatively simple lesson. There wasn't a whole lot to it this time outside of just reading the selection and understanding what an unreliable narrator is. If you are having issues, again, please reach out to me or Miss Kathy Vahovic, and we can book a tutoring session to try to help you understand the text. And I think that's about it. You got off easy this time with this lesson. Alrighty. So this is Miss Amber signing off, and good luck with the rest of your English class.